I'm going to talk about how to use NgRx ComponentStore. But before I start, let me just do a small survey, basically. Who heard of NgRx before? All right, I probably should have asked who haven't heard of it. OK, good. Who's using NgRx? Wow, OK. A lot of you. Awesome. Who've heard of NgRx ComponentStore? Good, probably like half the audience, and probably because we had a workshop just 2 days ago. Awesome. Who's actually using ComponentStore in their apps? All right, not a lot. Not a lot. OK, good. So I'm here to help you with that problem. But before I go there, just a quick thing. Yeah, Derek already introduced me. I'm a principal architect at Cisco. I'm part of the NgRx core team, so if you have any NgRx issues, you can just throw them at me. GDE in Angular, and I do organize Angular Toronto. I have a few stickers there, very shiny, if you want to grab them after. All right, so some of you know me as, I live in Toronto, Canada, and I lived there for the last 17 years. But what some of you might know is that I actually was born and grew up in Ukraine. And in fact, in that beautiful city, Kharkiv, that's where I graduated my school. That's where I almost completed my university before I moved to Canada. And funny thing about Kharkiv is it kind of is very close to our neighbor. So friendly, I wanted to say friendly, but didn't. Why am I telling you? At the beginning of this year, we were planning with my classmates, former classmates, a reunion 20 years after graduation in the class. Big event, we're planning for the summer. We're planning in January. Very excited about that stuff. And then 2 weeks later, or basically just over a week later, they sent a picture of my school in this state. You see, it wasn't very, nice to see. Of course, all the plans were canceled. 2 months later, the school looks like this. All right, so what I wanted to show you and say and show is why I'm showing you all this. A lot of Europeans and actually most of the world supported Ukraine at that time, and it continues to support this. So I'd like to all thank you for that. Thank you, your governments, for supporting this. And Ukraine really needs it, so please, thank you all. Means a lot. It means a lot. It means a lot. All right, so that was a small intro. But now I'm going to talk about ComponentStore. I mean, that's what you're here for. So what is ComponentStore? ComponentStore is a new state management library. I mean, it's been around for 2 years now from NgRx. It's completely standalone. So you probably, when you hear NgRx, you think of NgRx Store, right? So ComponentStore is the second state management library that is not dependent on the main one, the global store. It's literally one file with 392 lines of code as of today, I checked. And it's very much an awesome library. I'm going to show you how to use it today. But for those who've been, staying away from state management libraries and NgRx in general, think it could be complicated. I've heard those complicated or too much code and things like that. And especially for those who prefer to roll their own, hey, I want my service with behavior subject or with a subject kind of approach, something that Lara was talking about on Monday. She showed you actually the examples of that. The ComponentStore could be a great alternative to move over. It will be very easy to port into this. And this is, again, tiny library, very powerful, very performant, and very well tested. So you don't have to maintain your own kind of thing. All right, so that's that. ComponentStore been around for 2 years now. And in fact, as of mid of September, it became the second most popular state management library in Angular, which is quite a big thing. It's second because it's less popular than the global store. Nothing touches global store. 1 in 6 Angular applications are using the global store. And again, there's a lot of the numbers, but roughly half of the enterprises are using that. And you might notice, well, it was growing pretty good. Well, what the hell happened there? what the hell? Did you write the script to make sure it's very popular and just download it? Yeah? No, that actually NgConf happened. And there was a lot of there was 3 talks about NgRx ComponentStore there. So as you see, people got very excited and started adopting it immediately. All right, but again, second by all this stuff, I'm not saying that, hey, you should be switching from any state management library that you're already using. I'm not saying that, don't take it this way. For me, as long as you're using some kind of state management library, or you're even thinking about state, you putting it aside, you think how state flows in your app, that's already a huge win for your app and for your developers working on the app. So again, if you are using it already, any state management library, thank you. And again, your app thanks you, your developers thank you for doing this. State is a very important thing. Okay, so component store. Just like any state management library, it needs to do 3 things very well. It keeps the state, right? It keeps help you manage that state. So it needs to be able to read the data, and we have select method for that. It needs to be able to write the data, and we have the update for that. And it also needs to be able to handle side effects in your application. And that's what we have effect for it. Let me show you the basic APIs, because again, some of you have never heard of it before. So to use at least idea how you'd structure component store in general. So the first thing we'll do is we'll introduce the interface that this component store would be responsible for. Unlike the global store, which is a single source of truth, single object, one large shared state, component store could have many, many component stores, but still each one should be responsible for its own particular slice of state. So it should be very much aware of what it's controlling. Derived logic is done through selectors. Derived logic has no place in the store. I mean, there's some use cases for that, but in general, it should be a single source of truth, right? That's what you want for your app. That's why we do state management. So this would be the state handling the car items, for example, car items array. Next, we'll create the injectable class, injectable service, that will extend component store. And you'll see in a generic, in a component store, we'll specify that interface that we just defined, right? So that's what this store would be responsible for. In a constructor then, we can initialize the state. We could do it lazily and not specify it, but in this case, we specify because we wanted to have some initial state. All right, so that's initialization. Now, let's get how we read the data. Because we extend component store class, it gives us a few helper methods. One of them is select. So the first one you see there, we're exposing a read-only property for consumers of component store to use. They can subscribe to that. That would be an observable of car items. And the way we get it is we say, hey, we want to select it. We have the general shape of the store, which is state, right? It's general object. And we want to get car items. I mean, in our example, that was the only property. But really, it could be multiple and a few. But at the same time, please keep that state as small as possible, right? Because otherwise, your component stores won't scale. I mean, it won't scale because you'll be too large. Okay, so we now have your car items. Now, select itself can also do other things. For example, it can take one or more observables as an argument, and it would be listening for those observables to emit. And then the last argument there, this one is reduce car items to count. It's a function there. I didn't write the function just to make it more concise, but basically that function takes an array and reduces it to a single number, right? But what it does basically is it allows you to compound your selectors, and it allows you to derive data further, right? So in this case, card items count would be a single observable of number. How would you use it? Well, just like any other service, you'll just inject it in your store, in your component, and you would read from that observable property. If somebody knows, this is basically a push-based system, right? Push-based. And now my component would just react to every new cart item count if it changes. So basically, if you add items to the cart or remove whatever, it'll just automatically react to that. OK, so this is how we read the data, and we provide it to components to read the data. How would we write the data? For that, we have updaters. Updaters provide a prescription. So they say how you can update the data. So in this case, this setCart item, it's actually a callable method. It's like a callable property. I know it looks like a property, but it's actually a callable property. And in fact, you can see a bit later there in the code, it's also highlighted. This setCart items, I'm calling this, and I'm passing a single value to it. All right, now let's get back to updater. What it does, it takes the previous state or the current state as a first argument, and then the second argument is that value that you called that function with, that method with, right? That would be the second value. And then it needs to transform it to the new state in a mutable way. So that's why you see spreading and not just assigning value to the state cart items, right? So it spreads the state and updates the value. OK, so this is updater. Now, one other thing that any state management library has to deal with, and in fact, this is where the power of state management comes into, because by default, Angular is completely lacking this. And even if you do a service with the behavior subject approach, you still lack this part. This is a fact. This is one of the most powerful things in the global store, in NgRx store, and one of the most important and powerful thing in the component store as well. So let's break it down again, how it works. Effect is like the updater. It's also a callable method, basically. So add product will take product IDs. So you can call it with a single ID every time. What it would do, it will then turn it into observable of IDs. So every time you call it, it will push a new value in that observable, right? And then what do we do with this observable IDs next? Well, in this case, I'm using concat map, and I'm using that ID to actually call my service, which is basically a wrapper around the HTTP call client, right, to actually go and fetch the data. So this is how you would call it. In this case, I use concat map. This is where the value is. This is what the most important part is. Why? Concat map is one of the 4 flattening operators, higher order operators, that allow us to control the race conditions. Concat map will sequence the calls. So whenever an ID comes in and it starts working on it, then the second ID comes in. What do we do? That's where the power is, how we handle those race conditions. Concat map says, hey, if I'm working on this ID already, I'm adding the product already, and the new ID comes in, so what it would do, it will wait until that one completes, hold it, and then send the second one. So it basically makes a sequence. There is another operator, it's called merge map. The merge map operator will start working on the first ID, cool. The second ID comes in, is like, cool, I'll start work on it immediately as well. And whichever result completes first, it will be pushing them in further down the pipe. So it has no control over sequence, but because it does it in parallel, right? So concat map, merge map. Next one will be switch map. Probably a lot of you use it. Why? Some people are like, I don't know, it's just one of those. But basically, switch map does is, hey, I'm starting working, adding product, and now the new ID comes in. What switch map does is like, okay, stop whatever you're doing, use the new ID, start working on this. And there's also exhaust map, the final of those 4. The exhaust map says, hey, So you work on this ID, it starts working, then the next ID comes in, it's like, hey, I'm busy working with this, just drop it, right? So it ignores those. There are good use cases for all 4 operators. And this is where the power of effects are. This is what you get, an explicit control of race conditions. And this is, again, one of the biggest, more powerful things in any state management. All right, so now we have a product. What do we do with this? Well, we need to now store this value information about the car items, for example. This one, yeah, this one is interesting. Anyhow, I'm setting the car items in this case. I'm calling that updater, right, and passing the value to this. And of course, we want to handle errors, right? Yes, we do. We do want to handle errors. So we catch the error, we do handle it somehow. And this one is a little bit tricky because you do need to catch the error. I'm not going to go why. But you need to handle it and stop effect from collapsing, basically. So you need to keep effect always running. So you need to have like this tap plus catch error and empty. It was such a popular concept, such a popular thing over and over again. So we just said to quickly create a custom operator that basically does that for you. So tap response is basically what you saw that right now, but in just less code. First is the callback when it succeeds. The second one, when it errors, and second one is not optional. All right, so this is tap response. This is how you effect. And again, let's see how you use effect. Same thing, you inject the cart store, right? You call cart store add product, right? And notice this is providing that single product ID string, right? This could be a click handler event, right? On click, somebody clicks, and then that calls method on the component. And what component does? It just passes it to the component store to handle it, right? Notice we're not passing the observable. We're just passing the values. This is where we bridge the awkwardness, I guess, of some of the Angular APIs where some things are reactive and some things are actually declarative. This allows us to bridge that and still be able to control those race conditions through the effects. All right, so how to use ComponentStore? Yeah, so there's 4 use cases for this that we identified as a team. And they are distinct because they solve particular problems. First one, Singleton State, common component state, local component state, and fourth is component branch state. So those are the 4 use cases. And now it's lunchtime. No, wait a second. I'll go explain each one of them. So I'm going to show it in the app. This is the example app that's basically pre-built as part of the NgRx repository. But I adjusted it to fit all those 4 use cases in the simplest format possible. So it's a little bit overcomplicated. I mean, I typically won't write my app like that. But I wanted to demonstrate all 4 use cases. So we log in. Auth guys told me that I need to just password 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that works. Works. Okay, that's my secure password. It's better than 1111. Anyhow, I browse the books. So how does it work? This is the page that we introduced a number of component stores in. I'll show you how it works before I'll dive deep into the architecture of this and state flows of this. So we basically have a language that we can select. And again, we can select different languages, English, French, Deutsch. And then we can search for a book, right? We can look for a book or for my email. Now you can all email me. But basically, we want to search a book. It uses the Google Books API under the hood. It goes, fetches the books that we need to get, and displays them here. Okay, so as you see, not Alex, yeah, I'm searching for Angular. Here is Angular. And surprise, surprise, in Deutsch, and search Angular, all you get is Manfred. A lot of them, Manfred. Of course, he writes a lot of great books, so if you haven't read any of those, please do. A lot of them actually publishes free ones. But anyhow, this is the Angular. So you saw the search immediately, search for things. it uses the language that I select here again. Kind of silly example, but still it looks for those books in German. It also gives me a paginator. Paginator is my custom component that I created myself, again, to show some of those things, where I can select how many results I want per page. For example, I want 40 results. Boom. And you can see it searched immediately. Now I have 40 results, right? And again, it's more on Manfred. And Ferdinand is right here as well. Awesome. Anyhow, it shows me my search results from 1 to 40 of like 513. That's how many books it found with Angular. I can go next page, right? The paginator. I mean, that's how we do paginator. So 40 books, next 40 goes into other results as well. So you get the idea, right? Now, if I change to English, it doesn't search immediately, right? It doesn't search immediately because, hey, I just switched from German to English. Maybe I want to search for something else. But no, I want to search for Angular still. And here you'll see other results. Again, we can go to first page. We'll see Lars' book here. And Lars has been mentioned like already a lot of times today. Why is he not here? I don't know. Anyhow, he's a good friend of mine, Lars here. Anyhow, you can see the paginator is fully aware where they are. If it's the first result, there's no way I can go back, right? I can go only forward. I can go all the way to the last page. All right, so this is roughly the app, and we'll have all 4 use cases in this app. Let's take a look. That's the code itself. So this is the app. It has a number of components. So you have the toolbar at the top. It has a language selector, right? This is where we select the language. And when we select that language, this is what we want to search books in that language. Then it has the find the book page. And that's basically all of the page itself, right? That's the entire page, except for the toolbar, of course. Find the book page has its own components. One is this book search, so that's basically where we enter the search, and the paginator, if we have some results, it'll be paginating. And the second part is the book preview list, which is a larger component. This component is actually reused, so anyhow, this is a large component. And then book preview itself is a small component with the actual books, right? So fairly straightforward. And again, I need an example that shows the usefulness of it. Anyhow. All right, so this is the same app, but just in the component tree structure, right? I'm sure when you're designing new feature, you're like, okay, this will be my tree structure, right, in your design docs. That's all we all do. If you don't, please do, and your teammates will thank you. Anyhow, this is representation of the tree. Let's start with the first example, which is the Singleton State. As you might have guessed, okay, we'll see it'll be in the language selector area. So we'll create something as language store. And what makes it the Singleton? The service is provided in root. That means it becomes available anywhere in application. You can inject it anywhere in application. This store is laser focused. It keeps the current language code, right, the one we select, and just that, nothing else. And that's the key with the component stores. You want to have, the focus, especially if you use the provided in root. Now, I'm not a big fan of Singleton State, to be honest, for component stores, because I feel global store can do shared global things a lot better. And in fact, in my apps, I use both, and depending on which app, is it more of a global, more shared state, then I'll have more of it in the global store. Once I get to leaf nodes, like branches further down that don't share any information anywhere in the app, then those would be switched to component stores. And component store and global store, they work together very well, right? Although they're completely independent, they don't depend on each other, but they can work really well together. Anyhow, but say you have an app and you want to start smaller, or you have your own services with subject, this is one of the best way to start adopting component store, right? Having the same provided and root services that you already have, and just switch them to component store, efficient, performant, tested, library, reusable. Okay, so that's one component store. Now, let's look at the other area. Let's look at the paginator. And we wrote the paginator ourselves. Just to prove it, here's the code. So this is, I'm not using the material design paginator, right? So this is a component that is written by myself here. And this component is a common component. Let me show you again. It keeps its state, but it's a common component. What's a common component? Common component is component that could be plugged anywhere in the app. It does not really interact with any other services around it. It's not pulling in the data. It is communicating with its parent component only through inputs and outputs. This allows this component to be truly universal because you can plug it anywhere. It just communicates. So component paginator has no idea that you're talking about books or what to do with books at all, because it gets its data through the input, and when user changes values, goes to next page, or change how many items per page to show, that is the output. So it has the output event. And that's exactly what we have here. For example, a number of inputs, we use setters. And setters just pass the data to the component store inside of it. And we have output. This is the event. It's coming out of the component store as well as an observable. It has the view model itself, right? It needs to know about the range label, like from 1 to 10 of like 300 results, like that's the label. It needs to know if it has next, has previous. All that stuff is calculated internally in the paginator store. Okay. And as you see, when I click next page, it just clicks either updaters or effects in the component store itself. All right. One thing to note here, and it's very important. Unlike the Singleton component store, all other component store types or use cases, they just have injectable, no provided in root. No provided in root. We provide it in the component itself. Provided in the component itself. What does it do? It ties the life cycle of that component store to the life cycle of the component that actually provides it. So they become together. So when component is destroyed, component store is also destroyed, right? And that allows to kill all the subscriptions, to unsubscribe, and all the other things. Basically, it becomes tied to the lifecycle. But also what it means that for every instance of a paginator, it will have its own component store inside of it, right? This is very powerful because you might have multiple paginators inside. Each one will be just tied to the state of its component. All right. The next type would be local component state. So sometimes our component is aware of other services. It might be injecting a few, maybe even global store. And our component needs to do some business logic, right? But what I want to do is I want to outsource that business logic outside of the component. I want my components as simple as possible. I call my components as they are functions over data that produce the template. And when somebody interacts with the template, they just produce the outputs in the form of service calls or actual outputs in there, right? So this one would be responsible for page index, page size, and query title. Query title is something that we search for. Page index is which page we're on, and page size is how many in total we want, like 10, 20, like 40 results. All right, so that's the book search. And that store could be injecting other things in it as well. And in fact, it would. The last type of the store is a component branch state. This is the one where you define that component store on one node And that state would be used further down in the trees as well, like in the nodes further down in the tree. For example, in the bookstore example here, find the book page is using it, but also book search store is injecting it, and it talks to the bookstore already. And bookstore, again, is a single source of truth for the app on what books we have and what's the total of how many books in general we have, right? Because the API returns us, hey, here's your result. This is all the books you asked for. But it says also the total is like 350 of those search results if you want to continue iterating. And error in case as well, because APIs can error and things like that. So this is the branch state. And the idea of this use case, again, this is the one that owns some piece of state that would be available for every child or grandchild within that tree. But once again, once we move off find a book page to collection page, all that is gone, destroyed, auto-cleaned up, auto-unsubscribed. So this is the fourth and final use case. I know you're all eager for lunch, but let me just show you how all of this kind of works together. So we'll have this page, and the first thing I'll show the flow, this is called a state flows in the app. So when we change, we have the language selector. When we change the language, remember there was nothing happening really other than language selector changing. So when we change this, it just, when we click change it, it just goes to the language store. That's it. It's a very simple use case, for example. Nothing else triggers. But it could. If tomorrow your product manager says, hey, you know what, today, if your user changes from English to Deutsch and it already had English, like Angular search, you can search immediately, you can still do this. In our case, we don't. So that's language selector. Now let's take a look at somebody types in Angular and search appears. Okay, so what happens? Well, this is the input in the bookstore, right? In the book page there. So it's query title. Query title is then passed to the book search store. It combines the data with other things like page index and page size because it needs that for the search. And then calls bookstore saying, hey, I want the results with this data. User is on page 2, and we get like 10 results per page. And the query is Angular. So that's what it gets. Bookstore is like, OK, I got it. Now I know I also need a language for it. So it's like, OK, what's the language code? It combines that with that language code. And finally, this is all the inputs that we need to do the actual API. So we go book search the books with these parameters. It does the search. It's like, hey, here's your books results for what you asked for those 10 books on the page number 2. And it has total of like 340. It goes back to bookstore, hey, save this data. That data is saved, and then other components that are listening for that state, they're selecting it, they start reacting. For example, our book search store is like, oh, I'm interested in books. Oh, actually, I'm interested in total books. I'm interested in total books because that's what I want to pass to my paginator and pass it in there. And paginator is like, yeah, awesome. Now I can update my value there to 751. So that's the flow because we're selecting. We are reacting to state, right? All the things is reactive. Now, find the book page, listens for books, and it's like, hey, all right, I need those books because I need to pass them as an input to my book preview list, for example. And again, we could have had that book preview list directly queries it, but we reuse book preview page. And then those books spread out into multiple books into those components. Okay? So this is how we would search. That's the search flow. Now, what happens when somebody clicks the next page? I'm sure you're all dying to know. So paginator says, hey, my page index changed, and it outputs an event. Right? That's how it communicates to the parent. Outputs the event to the book search. Book search immediately is like, hey, somebody told me something. Bookstore, go figure it out. Book search store is like, OK, it's a page index. This is one of the triggers for me. This is something that I'm watching. So I better combine that again to all the things that I need for the book and send it to the bookstore. Bookstore is like, hey, it's language. What is it? Reacts automatically, right? Just it It's all reactive, combines them together, does the search comes back, goes to the bookstore, things that care about this data start to react to this as well. And it all goes down to where it belongs. And this is how our UI reactively updates the entire state. But you can see there's 4 different kinds of specific use cases. Each has its own unique case, right? So those are Singleton State, Common Component State, reusable components, local component state, and component branch state, where the state would be shared throughout the branch itself. My example is right there in the very short to find easy link. Alex Okrushko. Yeah, before you take pictures, hold on. This is my Twitter handle. So you can actually follow me on Twitter, and I'll post that link for you, I promise. That's my Twitter, yeah. That's my Twitter, that's the link, and I'll truly post it, I promise. Yes, I do. I'll give you another few seconds. We're over time anyway, but I'll give you 2 few more seconds to pull out your phones, of course, to capture it. All right. Don't promise that. I'll just observe. Anyhow, there's also NgRx IO guide for ComponentStore. If you want to read, you can go there. If you don't like the content, you can throw something at me, because I'm mostly the one maintaining that part. One more plug I'll do here. If you open the NgRx IO page yesterday or the day before, you might have noticed something new in there. Enterprise support button there. So this is something that we launched with some of the NgRx team members participating to provide the services. Because again, NgRx will always be free. NgRx will always be free, MIT, licensed, open source. That's a promise, right? So it's always been free. It's always will be free. It's been maintained meticulously by a team of roughly 5 people with various degree of involvement. But a lot of companies were still asking, hey, can you provide more support? This is a way to do it, right? Through the premium services, consulting, NgRx consulting, NgRx support, and workshops and training. Some of you took part of it here. Thank you. Hopefully it was very, exciting. Yeah. Awesome. Anyhow, contact us there if you have any questions. Somebody just last minute, Anna was talking about communities. So there are 2 Discords. One is the official Angular Discord with almost 28,000 people. If you're not there yet, why not join it? It's really good, right? Lots of topics, lively discussions. Angular core team members are also there participating. And NgRx has a similar one. We also have a channel in the global one, but this is also our own. And on that, thank you so much. Hopefully this was very interesting for you. Yeah.